Relatively Dangerous, a Generation X based fic. Chapter 2, Family Secrets. Yvette had woken up bright and early. She had to, since she was helping prepare a room for the new student. She was also a light sleeper, something that came about after being a captive of Emplate for so long. She checked the clock she had been given and saw it was a little after 5. Odds were no one was up yet, since very few of her classmates would get up this early. She quickly got out of bed and put on one of the casual outfits that Miss Frost had gotten for her. Most of her clothing were in shades of blue, or had something blue on them. There was also articles of clothing that had apples on them. Miss Frost had her pick out various items so she didn't have to rely on borrowed clothing, which was a blessing. All the tops her fellow classmates had were a bit tight on her. Once she was dressed and brushed her hair, she left her dorm room and headed to the main building. Since there were so few students at the school, the kitchen and pantry were pretty much open to the students. They just had to remember to clean up after themselves. Since Richard's arrival, she is starting getting her own food without causing a massive mess. This morning, she was going to have a simple breakfast. It would be a bowl of Apple Jacks, which she loved, and a glass of apple juice. It had become her normal breakfast since she started being a normal teenager. When she arrived at the kitchen, she was a little surprised to see someone there. It was Mr. Cassidy. She was so shocked that she almost forgot that he did like to remain informal with the students. She momentarily stood in the doorway, not even fully entering the room, as he turned to look in her direction. Once he had, she just smiled and said, "Sean, I'm surprised to see you here." Inwardly, she still felt a little odd using his name like that. He tended to remind her of a father figure. She noticed he had a worried look on his face, and could hear it in his voice when he responded, "I can tell you're surprised, lass. However, Yvette, I'm not the only one awake at this hour." She saw him point over to where the table was. She entered the room and looked in that direction and saw Miss Frost standing next to the counter, looking at the table. She was making a cup of coffee as well. She then saw Richard sitting at the table, and he looked like he hadn't slept well at all. She walked over to the table and saw him look at her. Even though she could see how drained he looked, she could see his eyes light up when he saw her. He even managed to smile for her. "Hi, love." Then she saw him lower his head as if he didn't want to tell her his next words. "I think I have bad news." Just by how he said it, she pieced things together. He had had a nightmare, and those were usually a sign that something bad was going to happen. She had a feeling that both of the teachers knew about it, since they were here with Richard. But she didn't want to make him verbally speak of it again. She quickly closed the distance between her and him. As she did so, she was sure his own mutant powers were latching onto hers, forming the mental link that they enjoyed when they were together. She reached the table, placing her hands on his, and once she did so, he started speaking to her in her native language. "I think someone from my past is coming after me." This statement confused her a little. In the time Richard had been at the school and they had been dating, he never really talked much about people who he didn't get along with, let alone would come after him. In fact, there was only one person she could think of that would come after Richard, and she had to suppress a shudder as she asked, "Is it Emplate? If it is him, we have to hide." She was still afraid of her former captor, and still only felt safe attacking him if he was weak. She was sure that in time she would conquer that fear. Richard then looked at her, and she saw the worry in his eyes. No, it's not him, although I wish it was. She was startled by this statement, and she could tell he noticed it. I can't explain why I wish that. She tried to think of the possibilities about why someone might wish that. Fear obviously came to mind, and no doubt it was someone Richard might fear. She did feel, however, that together they could face this dangerous foe. She then asked, Richard, who could scare you that much? Enough to make you wish Emplate was attacking? She realized that she asked the wrong question. Richard instantly tensed up. It wasn't enough to damage his clothing, but his hands had taken on the same form hers did when she used her powers. He managed to put some nasty cuts into the table. She had pulled back so he wouldn't cut her. She also heard the teachers come up behind her, no doubt concerned about what had just happened. She took the reaction that he wasn't ready to say more about it and decided to let him be. He would tell her when he was ready. She then turned around to face the two teachers, and almost instantly Mr. Cassidy asked her, Yvette, what did you say to him? She saw the worried look on his face and heard the worry in his voice. He must have seen how fast Richard had tensed up. She felt a little ashamed that she had caused him to do that, and she stepped back while answering Mr. Cassidy's question. I think I asked him something he doesn't feel ready to answer. She had a feeling that it was an answer that they didn't want to hear. Sure enough, she heard Miss Frost come up alongside her. Yvette, you probably know Richard better than any of us here. Is there anyone he might have told you about that he's made mad? Yvette closed her eyes for a moment, focusing on what she had learned from Richard. In the short time they had been in Item, she learned a bit about Richard's past. The only thing I recall is that he didn't get along with most of the guys he went to school with. Nothing he did to them specifically, but he didn't get along with them. She had turned to face Miss Frost, and saw the headmistress of the school did not look happy about her answer. That's a problem, then. The attacker in Richard's dream was female, not male. That worried Yvette, since he never mentioned anything about women he might have angered. Was there a girl that might have sought Richard's affection and didn't take no for an answer? Would that girl come after her? She was about to voice that train of thought when another voice spoke up. It caught her a little by surprise, but she recognized the voice due to the southern drawl in it. Oh my gosh! What happened to Richard? She glanced in the direction of the voice, and sure enough she saw a startled Paige Guthrie standing in the doorway. No doubt, while they had all seen Richard mimicking her abilities, no one ever saw him scared while holding those abilities. Yvette turned to face Paige and remained calm, even though she was starting to worry. She didn't need to start tensing up now. He had another of his nightmares last night. She glanced back at Richard and noticed he was starting to relax a little. She continued responding to Paige, however, as she did so. I may have hit a sensitive spot when I tried to inquire on it. She hoped that would satisfy Paige's curiosity. Over the past few weeks, she had a feeling that Paige might have been misinterpreting Richard's attempts to get her and Jonathan back together as interest in her. She heard Paige swallow as she realized that it was a reflex action. No doubt she was worried about another attack from Emplate. She had heard that Paige had been sliced up by Emplate during his first attack, no doubt when he still had her powers coursing through his system. Is Emplate going to attack again? Yvette had a feeling that question was going to be asked a lot. She was thankful when Miss Frost answered the question. She really didn't think she could handle repeatedly answering it. I don't believe that is going to be the case. Richard allowed me to mentally enter his dream, and the attacker was female. We don't know anything more than that, unless Richard cares to enlighten us on the possibilities. Yvette turned to Miss Frost and decided to voice the thought that had crossed her mind. Miss Frost, I had a thought. What if this female is someone who had feelings for Richard? She watched the head mistress's face as she mentally considered it. Something about the look on her face seemed to suggest that she didn't think that was the case, but she wasn't dismissing it. She then heard Paige say, Yvette, if that is the case, you might be in danger. It could be something like that movie, The Crush. She had never seen that movie, but something in Paige's tone seemed to hint that it was definitely a dangerous situation, whatever it had been about. She was about to respond to that, but she felt a hand on her shoulders. She turned her head and saw Richard had obviously recovered enough control over her powers to up and move again. He had a smile on his face, but she could see that it was forced. I wonder if that is what it is. A girl who had feelings for me, but I didn't because of some reason or another. He didn't have to say any more, but she could tell he was hiding something he didn't want to share just yet. She focused again on the mental link they shared when he had her powers. She had a feeling he was hiding something, but before she could ask, he was already talking to her in that link. Give me some time alone. There is someone I think it is, but I need to find the right way to explain it. She smiled at him. One she knew he would realize was comforting. Okay, I'll see you later. She saw him nod and watched as he left the room. She could sense everyone's eyes on her as he left and turned back to face them all. She knew they wanted to know what he said, so she took a deep breath and said, He has a feeling who it is, and he wants to tell me a little later. She could already tell they weren't totally happy with that, and she understood why. They were hoping he would explain before the attacker came, but fearing that the explanation would come afterwards. Monet St. Croix had just woken up and looked out on the day. Today, she felt, was going to be a nice day. It was to be a perfect day for the new student to arrive on. She quickly turned to her closet and pulled out one of her nicer outfits. As she did so, she heard a familiar voice in her head react to her choice. Ugh! I hate all those goody-goody outfits. It won't be right when our dear brother shows up to greet the new student. She shuddered and then said softly, Shut up, Claudette. Marius is not going to ruin this day. She then put on the outfit she had picked out. She also took a deep, calming breath. She always worried when Claudette tried to assert control. If it happened when someone who had strong psychic powers was around, they would know her darkest secret. Once she was calm, she left the dorm. To her surprise, she noticed another figure walking in her direction. It was Richard Cale, and it looked like he was lost in thought. As she walked in his direction, she could swear she felt Claudette paying extra attention. That would be a problem. So as she neared him, she made sure to pace herself so she didn't trigger his powers. Once she was close enough, she asked, Is something troubling you right now, Richard? She watched as he stopped, dead in his tracks, no doubt keeping his power in mind as well. She could tell he was a little surprised to have nearly run into her, but there was also displeasure in his face. When he did respond to her question, the response caught her off guard. It's nothing you can help me with, Monet. In fact, in this matter, you are the last person I would ask for help regarding this. She gasped, a little in shock and a little in insult. In her mind, she heard her own sister start to cackle. She ignored that and went a bit on the defensive. How can you be? How can you even think that? With all my abilities, I can help you with any problem you might have. She could have even listed all the times she had saved the team with them. To her shock, his response to her offer made her shut her mouth. Oh, really? Did you reveal the truth about your brother to them, or did he expose it? She didn't want to voice the answer, since it had been him who revealed the familial link. When she didn't answer, she heard him press on. When I took on your powers, I noticed something odd. I still don't understand it, but one word tends to enter into my mind when I think about your powers, or better yet, you. Gestalt. I've sensed something in you, a part that is separate, yet part of you. What's the full story with you? She wanted to respond to that statement, but she wasn't sure how at that moment. She had told him one thing, but it wasn't the truth. She had made it up, hoping his power wouldn't pick up on Claudette. As she tried to respond, she heard her sister respond in her mind. He is clever. He knows I'm in here, but he doesn't know exactly who I am. He's a threat that our brother needs to remove. She disregarded what her sister said and decided to counter in an appropriate way. Richard, there is more to me than you. Or them. No. I'm still trying to figure out how to properly explain it all. What you need to remember is that I am on your side, and on the side of Generation X. She hoped that would satisfy him for the moment. She just hoped that she wouldn't need to tell anyone the truth. And if she had to, she hoped a partial truth would work. She watched as he took a step backwards, no doubt to prepare to change direction. Well, I hope you can figure it out. Right now, I need to figure out how to tell Yvette about one person I fear as much as your brother. She then heard him let out a sardonic-sounding laugh. Maybe if I can figure that out, it might inspire you to tell them about your secret. Maybe you can even explain why my mind thinks gestalt around you. Again she heard Claudette cackle in her mind, and for a moment she had a feeling that Richard's problem was a family issue. She quickly blocked out her sister's laughter and asked a question. Richard, what exactly is bothering you about this? She could see him processing the question, and for a moment she felt he was going to answer the question. Before he could, she heard the unmistakable voice of Jubilation Lee answer the question. From what Paige just told me, he had another nightmare. You remember what happened last time he had one? She looked in the direction of the voice and saw the Asian American former X-Men, and to her own chagrin, Everett Thomas, right by her side. They were looking as close as Richard and Yvette had gotten lately. She didn't want to verbally admit it, but she also had feelings for Everett as well. While she had been distracted, she saw Richard had started to walk away. She went to say something to him, but as he walked away, she heard him mumble something about too many cooks. It had to be one of those old cliches he liked saying from time to time. No doubt he wanted time alone to think things over. As she saw him pick up his pace, she noticed Everett and Jubilation had gotten close enough so they wouldn't have to raise their voices. Everett was obviously watching as Richard got farther and farther away. As he watched him, she heard Everett say, "This one has him really spooked." Paige had said Yvette had asked him a question, and it resulted in him tensing up and putting some nasty gouges in the table. That made Monet raise an eyebrow in surprise. She turned back to the others and sighed. "So, where do you think he's going to go to think things over?" In part, she wanted an idea of where to avoid, but part of her wanted to know in case she had a chance to talk to him again. He had hit a nerve when he used the word gestalt. It was Jubilation who answered the question. "Well, since Beast took Artie, Leech, and Franklin to the X-Men's temporary home, Rich might be disappearing to the treehouse." She nodded and figured that would be a good idea. Usually the kids somehow made their way to the treehouse at the first opportunity. Then Jubilation continued her statement, and that made her worry. "He might get an hour of peace. I think Ange, Jono, and Mondo are going to be doing some practice in the grotto after breakfast." For a moment she recalled that she needed food as well. She looked at the two and asked, "Did you two have breakfast yet?" When both shook their heads, she realized that Paige must have bumped into them during the start of her morning jog. She then said, "Then let's all go get some food. We do have a lot of work to do today." They all started to head in the direction of the dining hall. And doing so, she hoped that Claudette wouldn't try to cause any trouble. This day was already going to be a problem, should anything arise. Jonathan Starsmore looked around the biosphere. He, Angelo, and Mondo had all decided that since the whole Black Tom incident, where Mondo had ended up captured, they all needed to pick up their training. The Blighter had managed to get the drop on all of them, and they thought they were prepared for such a thing. Obviously, they hadn't been, although at the time, Angelo appeared to be the best prepared. This morning, they had decided on the practice situation. Each one of them had to try and get the drop on the other two. As Emma had often suggested, they would test out their abilities on each other. As of right now, he was trying to figure out how each would think. He had no doubt that with his abilities, Angelo would be sticking to the trees. His friend had taken to doing like Spider-Man with his powers. Jonathan couldn't fault him for that one. Mondo would be the trickier one to deal with. With Mondo's powers, he could literally morph into the very ground of the biosphere. That would make each step he took a risky move. The only thing in his favor was that Mondo couldn't be everywhere. That would stretch him out too thin. So Jonathan knew he had to be careful with each step he took. Jonathan looked around for a moment, getting his bearings. He was near the tree house. As he looked at it, he noticed something odd about the tree he was under. There were some grayish vines hanging down from the tree. He spun around and backed away from the tree, getting closer to the treehouse was in. As he did so, he glanced up and saw Angelo up in the tree. He responded to his teammate as he let loose a small blast to shake the tree. "Nice try, Angelo, but your timing was off." As Angelo fell to the ground, doing his best to land with minimal injury, Jonathan heard him respond to the statement, "You got me, but I think Mondo's got the jump on both of us." It was then he noticed that the ground under their feet was starting to shake. It took him a second to realize that they were both literally on top of Mondo. Jonathan couldn't react in time as Mondo fully sprang up, sending both he and Angelo in different directions. Angelo flew back against the tree he had been in. Jonathan had flew back into the tree and managed to land on a branch just below the treehouse. As they both landed in the trees, Mondo took more of his normal form, with a smile on his face. Well, did I do well with waiting for you to arrive? Angelo had been the first to respond, and Jonathan could hear a bit of laughter in his friend's voice. You did very well, Mondo. I think you would have had surprised many of the guys I used to hang with. Jonathan had to agree with that, especially after the road trip they had ended up taking. I'm just right, Mondo. You waited for the right moment and took advantage of our focus on each other. You successfully reminded us how valuable the element of surprise can be. Jonathan knew how powerful surprise could be, however. The moment that stood out the most to him had been when his power had manifested. The surprise of that moment had left Gale paralyzed, and had given him a bit of a guilt complex. Sometimes he would hear that very explosion even though it had happened some time ago. He even heard it now. To his surprise, the treehouse was the source of the explosion. He realized, however, what was the actual source of the explosion. Before the blast, he heard the beginning of a certain word. Soon enough, he saw a familiar figure come flying out of the treehouse. He could have sworn he also heard the figure start to swear, but it was drowned out by the explosion they all heard. They all ran for the figure that had flown out of the treehouse. It didn't take Jonathan long to figure out what exactly had happened. As they all reached the figure, Jonathan saw that it had been Richard Cale, and he had obviously realized what had happened as well. Richard only had half a face at the moment, and the newest member of their team said, Ugh, I probably should have checked if someone was going to be here today. Jonathan saw Mondo reach out a hand to help Richard up. It might have helped avoid this. Are you alright? Is there a reason you were up in the treehouse when we were practicing? He then saw Mondo looked a bit worried. Ever since the Black Tom incident, Mondo treated Richard as one of the best friends he would ever had. You know you could tell me if something was wrong. As Richard stood up, he answered the question, although it seemed a little reluctant. That was a bit understandable, since Mondo could be a bit persistent when it came to someone he was worried about. Sorry, I had needed some time to myself to think about something. I had a nightmare last night. Jonathan had remembered what had happened the last time Richard had a nightmare. The day after that, M-Plate had attacked the school, and had been a near disaster. Judging by the look on what currently remained of his face, Richard must not have had much sleep last night. Is this something we need to be worried about? Inwardly, he hoped it wasn't something that could be dismissed, but deep down he had a feeling it wasn't. He really didn't want anything to happen, especially since he was hoping to apologize to Paige about what happened last Thanksgiving. To be honest, I don't know. However, I think I finally know how to explain to Yvette what has been on my mind. For a moment he saw Richard go to cover his mouth before stopping. Forgot that I don't have a mouth when I have your powers, Jono. He then looked up at the treehouse. Ugh. I'm gonna hate explaining to Artie, Franklin, and Leach why their treehouse is missing a wall. Jonathan watched as Angelo put a hand on Richard's shoulder and just smiled. Don't worry, Rich. Ev and I will have it patched up before they return. We helped build it in the first place. Inwardly, Jonathan was thankful he wasn't included in that project. He had decided that it was finally time that he should patch things up with Paige. In fact, maybe he could do so during the arrival of the new student. At that moment he heard Mondo ask a different question, probably to change the mood. Hey, Richard, What do we know about the new arrival? Isn't she someone your uncle had been protecting? He watched as Richard reached into the pocket and pulled out a letter. According to what my uncle had included in the letter he had somehow sent out before you know what happened, it says her name is Daria, and she's around Jubilee's age. Anything else we have to find out when she gets here. It wasn't an answer Jonathan had wanted to hear, but it was probably the best they were going to get. He did roll his eyes, and then asked the other important question on his mind. All right, so is there a reason why we are all supposed to go get her? He felt this was unusual, since every time a new student came to the school, they were always greeted by one teacher and maybe one student. He watched as Richard looked at the letter again. The letter says it would be best. It could be possible that somehow he figured that Emplate might attack. Maybe he wasn't sure if there would be some survivors of what he did to Zero Tolerance. Jonathan had to give that thought a nod. The latter was definitely possible, since he must have set some safeguards in place to protect the girl. Someone could have exploited it for their own end as well. He saw Angelo nod. Sounds about right. With all the various groups and enemies that some of us have made, there would probably be safety in numbers. Let's face it, airports haven't been good places for us. Jonathan had to admit that Angelo was right. Emplate attacked him at the airport and tried to ambush Richard there as well. They even got into a fight at the airport when they found Mondo there. He noticed that Richard was nodding and even had his eyes closed. For a moment he thought Richard might have even fallen asleep. But then he saw him open his eyes. It was obvious that he'd just had a revelation about something. I better go. There is something I need to talk to Yvette about, and I need to tell her about it before we go to the airport. He then saw Richard dash off, no doubt, if Jonathan recalled right, in the direction of the girl's dorm. He remembered that the others had started to work on preparing a room for the new girl. Once Richard was gone, Jonathan looked up at the treehouse. It might take some time to get the treehouse fixed up. He then said to the others, Think we should stop training and maybe start fixing the treehouse? Or maybe helping prepare for the new arrival? He glanced at the others and saw Angelo shaking his head. He had a feeling he knew why. I still need to get the drop on both of you. He, Mondo, and Angelo then all headed back to training. They still had some time before they would all depart for the airport. Jubilation Lee looked around the room, taking in all that they had done from her vantage point. The room had become decorated a mix of what everyone had liked, since no one had a clue what the new student would like. Right now she was helping Yvette, whom she still called Penny, hang up the blue curtains she had picked out. They were currently being assisted by Monet, whose help consisted at this point of saying, I think you need to move it to the left. This was frustrating since Jubilation knew how to hang curtains, and that while the curtains looked old-fashioned, they didn't need to be exact in centering them. It was also frustrating because since the whole Onslaught incident and their temporary stay at Emma's Canadian residence, Monet and her had called a truce. Still, Monet's uber-critical eye was starting to get on her nerves. More out of frustration, Jubilee said, Monet, if you want to help, why don't you get up here and help us instead of telling us what to do? The response she got was calm, which was a plus. She had noticed earlier that Monet was a little bothered by something, no doubt linked to her encounter with Richard earlier. I am helping, Jubilation, by watching from here. I can notice things you can't because I am not close to it. Besides, it was a suggestion. Not in order. She was about to respond to that last comment when Everett spoke up from where he was. I think it looks fine, Jubes. She looked at him, and it calmed her a bit to see his smile. While she was sure his opinion was a little biased, it was still a vote for her. Paige, who was busy helping Everett in making the bed for the new girl, looked for a moment before responding. I don't know. I think it needs to go a bit to the right. The response made Jubilation want to roll her eyes. Three different people giving three different opinions. While she had to agree with Monet's logic that someone not close to the curtains would be a better judge, three different opinions made it difficult to know who was right. She turned towards the redhead and asked, What do you think, Penny? We need a tiebreaker. Jubilation always viewed Yvette as a sister, even though she never had a real sister. Since Richard's arrival and Yvette came out of her shell, she knew Yvette viewed her the same way. She watched as Yvette looked it over and then looked out at everyone. She had a feeling that Yvette was trying to figure out whom she should trust most on this. After a moment, she responded, Well, sis, I don't know who is right. I think we need a tiebreaker. She then saw Yvette lean towards her and heard her softly say, And Monet was right. She didn't give an order. Jubilation noticed that Yvette had shivered for a moment, as if she had remembered something awful. It was a reminder that Monet was definitely not like her brother, the evil mutant vampire M-Plate. Jubilation sighed and then said, All right, can someone help us break this tie? I would like to get down from here. She was starting to get tired of holding the curtain up while they were trying to set it. It was that moment that she heard a new voice in the room, at least half an inch to the left and a look right. The statement was more helpful than Monet's, but she could tell the speaker was a bit tired. It was even better that Richard had arrived when he did. She had a feeling that Yvette was starting to get a little anxious with how things were. Once they set the curtain, they both got down, and Jubilation wasn't surprised when Yvette had rushed over to Richard's side. As they had been working on things, Yvette had mentioned to her a few times that she was concerned about him. She looked at Richard and said, How are you right now? How are you right now? I know Penny's been very worried regarding, well, you know. She saw him weakly smile and said, I've gotten my head around a few things. I hope you don't need Yvette anymore, since I need to have a few words with her in private. Jubilation could tell by a look that what that was in Yvette's eyes that she figured this was something private about him, something he felt he needed to tell her first. In the short time he had been at the school, they had all realized the bond the two had formed, and if he needed to share anything, she was the first to know. It became very important after his depression had hit, and everyone tried to respect it. Almost on cue, she saw Yvette look at her and the others and said, Guys, this is important. I hope I'm not leaving you short-handed. Jubilation looked around the room, and to be honest, she thought they were close to finished with preparing the room. Paige was the first to respond, and Jubilation had to agree with her. It's all right, Yvette. We're almost done here, anyhow. Before anything else could be said, Yvette and Richard had left the room. To be honest, Jubilation couldn't blame her. If Everett might be in a similar state, she would have done the same. Silence hung in the air after Yvette had left for a few moments before Paige finally broke it. I wonder if what he wants to talk to her about is what she asked him earlier. It struck a nerve. Jubilation had been wondering about that. She hadn't even thought about asking Paige earlier when she told them what had happened. She turned the page and figured now was a good time to ask. Any idea what Penny had asked him that caused him to tense up earlier? In all honesty, she didn't expect an answer that would shed light on the situation. She wasn't overly surprised when Paige just shook her head. I honestly have no idea what she asked, although Miss Frost did seem to hint that the attacker was going to be female. At that moment, Jubilation noticed that Monet was biting her lower lip. No doubt that little encounter that she and Everett had seen earlier had revealed something, or maybe a clue at what was going on in Richard's head. What is it, Monet? What are you thinking? She saw Monet look away for a moment, and then said, almost with a bit of discomfort in her voice, I think he may have a skeleton in his closet. Something or someone he was hoping he would never face again. Jubilation could only think of one reason that Monet would come to that conclusion, and it didn't make her feel good. Please don't tell me that it's like you and M-Plate. We don't need another situation like that. To her chagrin, Monet didn't face her, but just shrugged. Maybe, but I'm not certain. It could be a similar connection, though. That didn't make Jubilation feel better. She then felt a hand on her shoulder, and she glanced back to see Everett was right there. He had a comforting smile on his face. Relax, Jubes. If it is anything like M-Plate, we can handle it. While that did make her feel better, deep down she was hoping that whatever the skeleton in Richard's closet might be, it wouldn't be someone like what she had crossed paths with once. A version of herself working for Mojo with the name Abkissa. Richard walked out of the girls' dorm hand in hand with Yvette and back to the main building. He had finally figured out the right way to tell her what he had been thinking about all this time. He wasn't worried about being overheard, since when he was with her, they could communicate using the mental link they shared when he had her ability. Yvette, there is something I need to tell you about. Something from my past. It was the most delicate way he could put it. He looked at her and saw her looking at him. In her blue eyes he could see concern. She was worried, and he knew she would have a right to be. What is it? Is it linked to the nightmare you had? If he was right about who the figure in his dream was, she had all right to be concerned. The tricky part had been how to begin this part of the story. It was a bit of a dark part of the family history. I believe it is linked to the nightmare. You remember how I told you about my uncle, the one who married my mother's sister? After the whole situation that led to the upcoming arrival at the school, he felt he needed to clarify that part. She nodded, recalling the details he had shared with her about that. Yes, he's the one with precognition. He was the one who helped identify your powers. So he's not a blood relation to you. It had become common knowledge in the world that mutants could not use their powers directly on blood relations, unless there was a power level linked to that as well. That was something there wasn't much clarity on. He looked forward as they reached the main building on the campus. Correct. He had been in the military when he first got out of school. He actually had been called into one of the wars. In some ways, he was one of the lucky ones who came back, but he did get injured. The injury left him unable to have children. When he was younger, Richard couldn't wrap his head around that idea. But as he got older and a little wiser to the world, he realized what kind of injury could do that. To his surprise, Vet seemed to pick up on that faster than he had when he first heard about it. "Oh my goodness, that must have been horrible. I know my parents had first explained that to me when I was going to have a baby sister." For a minute he saw a look of sadness cross her face. For a brief moment Richard had a memory pop up in his head. Something about a friend of the family overseas expecting a second child. But it disappeared. Just as suddenly when Yvette came to the next conclusion. Did they adopt them then, since he couldn't father a child? He nodded, recalling the first child they took in. They did. The first child they adopted was a boy. They got him when he was just a baby. Everyone in the family loved him, and he was happy. Richard stopped as he yawned. Almost as if his yawn was a prompt, he felt Yvette's hand squeeze his hand. "What happened then? Did he do something bad?" He shook his head and squeezed her hand as well. "No, he did nothing bad. He wanted a sibling." They went through the process again and adopted a girl. She had come from a broken home and had not had much luck in foster homes. It wasn't until she joined the family that it was found out that she was the cause. He shuddered, remembering how they had found out. He then felt his legs give out a little. The lack of sleep, as well as the emotional drain recalling that painful memory, was a bit much for him. To his relief, Yvette managed to catch him and help him stay up. As they entered one room, one with a couch, she said to him, "I think you need to tell Mr. Cassidy and Miss Frost as well. I can go get them." He nodded, and then yawned again. She had a point in that the teacher should know. Unfortunately, he doubted he could stay awake much longer. He needed some rest. He went over to the couch and said to her, "I think you're right, but I need some rest. Can you wake me before we have to leave to get Daria from the airport? It may be the only way to avert this nightmare from coming true." He had been looking at her, lost in her eyes as he asked that. She returned his smile and held his hand as he laid down. "Of course. I will wake you when it is time to go." He yawned again, and he closed his eyes. He felt at ease, especially as Yvette said aloud, "I will protect you like you protect me." Not too far away, Sean was going over what they would need to do to pick up the new girl. It was getting closer to the time they would need to leave for the airport. The drive there would take some time, as would the drive back. With the worry of Richard's dream, he was trying to minimize the opportunity any threat might have. The fact that the mystery figure in the dreams was still an unknown female wasn't helping matters. What also did not help matters was the fact that Emma was looking out the window in thought. No one seemed to like the fact that this attacker was an unknown female. The only thing they could figure was that it was someone linked to Richard. After a moment more of the silence, Emma finally said something he did not really want to consider. "Sean, what if this threat from Richard's dream is the new girl, Daria? We still know next to nothing about her." Sean sighed, since he had briefly entertained the notion but ruled it out. "I highly doubt that is the case, Emma. If she were a threat, why would his uncle out her in his why would his uncle put her in his care?" He did not want to admit that. It was highly unlikely that it was some sort of plot along those lines, especially after what Emma had told Jean and Scott. He heard Emma sigh and then respond, "Sorry, Sean, but I am trying to prepare for what might happen. You can hope for the best, but I will prepare for the worst. Richard could be mentally going through what older siblings go through when faced with the prospect of a new sibling. Besides, she was in zero tolerance. That might have warped her mind a bit, especially if she wasn't sure she was a mutant." Sean had to give Emma a little credit for that. The new girl had joined the anti-mutant group. There were some individuals who hated their own race. The only thing that kept him from really considering it was the detail he was about to mention. "Emma, we can't suspect Dari on that. We don't even know what her powers might be." He saw Emma was about to counter that statement, but stopped when they both heard knocking on his office door. It wasn't fully closed, but all of the students did knock to be polite when it was only ajar. He glanced at the door and said, "Come in." He watched as the door opened and Yvette came back in, a look of mild concern on her face. It almost worried him, but he had a feeling what her arrival was about. He calmly asked, "Did he tell you something, Yvette?" She nodded and sat down in one of the chairs he had in his office as she answered, "Yes, but I told him he should be the one who tells you this. All he gave me were little details. What I can say is that the person he has a feeling it was in the dream, might have been the daughter of his mother's sister." Sean noticed a look of surprise on Emma's face, as that question seemed to diffuse her theory on that it might be Daria. He then saw a frown on her face, and he felt it on his face as well. This returned the possible attacker into someone they all didn't know, except for Richard. In a moment, Emma finally asked, "Is it possible for Richard to elaborate more on this matter? If this is something we need to prepare for, the more time we have, the better." It was another valid point. If Richard did have an idea who the attacker would be, and their powers, they needed to prepare for them. He noticed that Yvette quickly looked away, as if she didn't want to be scolded for what she was about to say. "The lack of sleep had caught up with him, Miss Frost. He fell asleep in the lounge, on the sofa in there." That worried Sean a little. Since the time to leave for the airport was getting closer and closer, he was worried that Richard wouldn't be awake in time. After a moment, he saw Emma walk over to Yvette and place a hand on the girl's shoulder. He wondered what it was all about until Emma said, "Yvette, I know you are worried about Richard, and if he might have another nightmare. So why don't you go back to the lounge and stay by him? Besides, you may need to wake him up if he's not awake by the time we have to leave." He watched as Yvette nodded, and then left the room, heading back to the lounge. Once she was out of the room, he glanced over at Emma, and before he could say a word, she looked at him and said, "No, I didn't try to influence her. It takes a lot to get through all the barriers she has set up, which is partially due to her native language and partially due to her own powers. You'd have to be blind not to see the love she has for Richard." He held up a hand, yielding to her evident point. He had been thinking so much about what might be coming that he didn't even think of the obvious in this case. "You're right, Emma. I should have known better. This whole dream thing has me on edge. I just hope the lad wakes up before we have to leave. If this dream is right, that could be the only thing that could prevent it from playing out." He watched as Emma nodded, and then crossed her arms in front of her. "From what I saw, they were the only two here. I doubt if Vet would leave with us, with Richards asleep in the lounge. If we have to leave them both behind, then we have someone stay here with them. It's not ideal, but it's better than not going right away. Who knows what dangers Daria might end up in if we don't go right away." He had to agree with them on that. Still, he started getting a nagging feeling that something bad was going to happen. What was worse was that if something did happen, Richard had expressly forbid letting his family know about the bad things that did happen to the school. Yes, they had told his father about Emplate's last attack, but they hadn't told them about Richard's depression or Bastion's arrival. He thought that somehow this was something that should be known about. But to be honest, how could he breach that? Even worse, how would he breach it if something bad did happen to Richard today? Sean sighed and then started to get ready to go. The time to go to the airport was getting nearer and nearer. He just hoped that Richard would wake up before they had to go. It would be two less things to worry about.